Welcome to the Have Mandolin Will Travel podcast. This is Enter Four Murderers, Macbeth. In October 2024, Opera Orlando is performing Giuseppe Verdi's 1847 opera Macbeth. I'm really looking forward to it, and I thought it might be fun to watch some different versions of Shakespeare's Macbeth as a prelude to Verdi's opera adaptation, similar to what I did with Lucia de Lammermoor and The Bride of Lammermoor. I was originally going to watch the 1979 Royal Shakespeare Company film, and then, inspired by my recent Yojimbo experience, watch Akira Kurosawa's adaptation Throne of Blood. But then, perhaps not surprisingly, I completely lost control of the assignment and ended up watching four versions of Macbeth in a week. Macbeth 1979, starring Ian McKellen and Judi Dench, The Tragedy of Macbeth from 2021, starring Denzel Washington and Frances McDormand, Macbeth from 2015, starring Michael Fassbender and Marion Cotillard, and Macbeth 1971, starring John Finch and Francesca Annis. It was a very interesting and rewarding experience that I am now going to subject you to my thoughts on, so strap in. Short summary. All four of these films were rather different than each other, and all were quite good. Note: Macbeth 1971 was directed by Roman Polanski. I have some deep ambivalences about consuming it and talking about it, given I think it's really good and would normally recommend it, but Polanski. I did not pay for it and would not encourage you to either. Maybe borrow it from the library. Part 1. A brief Shakespeare intro. One man in his time plays many parts. As You Like It. Act 2, Scene 7. I love Shakespeare. Like a lot of people, I was first exposed to his works in high school, and my affection for them really crystallized my senior year, as I had a really good teacher. Thank you, Mrs. Gutherman. After college, I discovered the teaching company and devoured all of their Shakespeare courses. In addition to being fantastic lecture series, they all had guidebooks with really good bibliographies, which directly led to my extensive, for a layman, library of Shakespeare criticism. I'm most familiar with the histories and the tragedies. I'm admittedly pretty weak on the comedies. I think the most important single takeaway from my studies is that the text of a play is not the play. A play is meant to be performed, so reading it as if it were a book doesn't really capture the full picture. I would never read a screenplay and then claim I'd seen a movie. The play text, like a screenplay, is the recipe, not the meal. How events are framed, how the actors deliver the lines, how the actions are blocked in stage, all can lead to wildly varying interpretations, even from the same starting text. Different productions aren't adaptations of some pure version of the plays. There is no definitive Hamlet. There's just the recipe. Make whatever dish with it you will. Shakespeare's works have minimal stage directions and very little guidance as to how a scene is meant to be played. There's nothing in the text that says, the characters enter a blasted heath and look nervous. There are deep shadows. The light is green and unnatural. Cue ominous music. This lack of explicit direction and the richness of the language itself is what gives Shakespeare's work such immense versatility. To me, the best example of this flexibility is the character of Shylock from Merchant of Venice. He's the Jewish moneylender who gives the "if you prick us, do we not bleed" speech. Shylock was originally portrayed as a cartoonish anti-Semitic stereotype, a greedy usurer with a comical giant hook nose. After World War II and the Holocaust, the portrayals of Shylock shifted and he became a more sympathetic character. The text as written supports both interpretations. Even dead in the middle of England's 400-year ban on Jews entering the kingdom, Shakespeare still gave Shylock this powerful speech. He hath disgraced me, and hindered me 500,000. Laughed at my losses, mocked my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies. And what's his reason? I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why? Revenge. The villainy you teach me I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. To me, the plays are living recipes, and one of the reasons they're still kicking around after 400 years is that they can support so many different readings in different cultural times. Is King Henry V a gallant hero leading his men from the front, or a cynical manipulator that gives pretty speeches before sitting back and sending men to die for his ego? Does the play Henry V celebrate the purity of martial valor, or does it critique the romanticization of war? That's an exercise for the director, the actors, and the audience. This flexibility is not a bug, it's a feature. I'm not a purist. I don't care if a production changes things. It's better, of course, if the changes are purposeful and support the ideas the production wants to emphasize, but even failure can be interesting and instructive. So with all that out of the way, let's talk about Macbeth. Part 2. The text of Macbeth. Thy letters have transported me beyond this ignorant present. Macbeth, Act 1, Scene 5. Macbeth, considered one of Shakespeare's great tragedies, was first performed in 1606. Shakespeare, as he frequently did, used Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland as his source. The real Macbeth was an 11th century king of Scotland, but his life apparently wasn't very much like that of the Macbeth that had passed into historical legend by Shakespeare's time. I might not need to do this, but a quick summary of the plot. Generals Macbeth and Banquo have put down a rebellion against King Duncan. After the battle, they meet 3 witches on a heath who prophesy that Macbeth will be king and that Banquo's descendants will be kings, though he himself will never rule. Banquo's descendants are later shown to be the Stuart family, which includes James I, the sitting king of England when Shakespeare wrote the play. Later, Macbeth, encouraged by his wife, murders King Duncan and is himself crowned. Facing his own paranoid nihilism, he has more people murdered. He goes to see the witches again, who tell him none of woman born shall harm Macbeth, and that he shall triumph until Birnam Wood marches on Dunsinane. Emboldened by this, he murders the family of Macduff, the Thane of Fife. A group of rebel thanes, i.e. lords, led by Duncan's son Malcolm, raise an army and attack him. To hide their number, they cut down the trees from Birnam Wood and carry them along. During the battle, Macbeth is killed in single combat by Macduff, a man born via cesarean section, and the crown passes to Malcolm. The end. Macbeth is a little unusual compared to Shakespeare's other tragedies in that it's really short, with audio recordings of the full text coming in at 2 hours 20, which is about 40 minutes shorter than Othello, King Lear, and Romeo and Juliet. This means you don't need to cut much out of Macbeth to make it a palatable film length. For reference, Kenneth Branagh's unabridged 1996 film Hamlet is 4 hours long. The 4 Macbeth films I looked at ranged from 1 hour 45 to 2 hours 25. To quote Harold Goddard from his The Meaning of Shakespeare Volume 2, "The main technical peculiarity of Macbeth is its brevity. It is so short that not a few have thought that what has come down to us is just an abbreviated staged version of a much longer play. As it stands, it has no beginning in the Aristotelian sense, scarcely even a middle. It is mostly end. The hero has already been tempted before the opening of the action." Page 111. Though I would submit that the truth of that last sentence can shift depending on what choices a production makes early in the play. More on this later. In addition to being short, the plot is also pretty straightforward, and there's not even much of a B-plot. As far as characters go, it's pretty much Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, and a bunch of minor characters that mostly react to the main character's actions. Even Banquo and Macduff, the most dramatically important secondary characters, aren't huge presences in the text, having about 7 times and 4 times fewer lines than Macbeth, respectively. Almost everyone else is either a servant relaying a message or a minor noble who shows up at the end for the final battle. Here's a breakdown of the top 8 speaking parts by how many lines each has, per shakespeareswords.com. 1. Macbeth, 7:15. 2. Lady Macbeth, 2:59. 3. Malcolm, 2:11. 4. Macduff, 180. 5. Lords, 135. 6. Ross, 135. 7. Banquo, 113. 8. Duncan. So Macbeth absolutely dominates this play. It's kind of funny that the 5th largest speaking part is a catch-all for multiple anonymous lords, which speaks to the minor nobles being sort of interchangeable. I was actually really surprised to find Malcolm has that many lines. He doesn't make a huge impression on the viewer, and he vanishes for a very long stretch of the play. Most of his lines are concentrated in an Act 4, Scene 3 conversation with Macduff that often gets extremely chopped down. Of the 4 versions I watched, only Macbeth 1979 retained all of Malcolm's lines in that scene. Part 2A. Themes, images, and general points of interest. The evil that men do lives after them. A study in evil. Macbeth, in contrast to every other Shakespeare play except Richard III, has a title character that is also the villain of the piece. But unlike Richard III, in Macbeth, Shakespeare invites the viewer to empathize with the villainous protagonist. Richard III is a self-consciously theatrical character that falls into the love-to-hate category. Macbeth is not. He is not performing for and giving winking asides to the audience the way Richard is. Richard is already a monster before the play begins, and he ends the same person he started as. It's just his fortunes that have changed, not his character. Macbeth is a story of a man's descent into evil and nihilism. To quote Goddard again, Macbeth, like Crime and Punishment, is a study of evil through a story of murder. Each is its author's most rapid, concentrated, terrific, and possibly sublime work. Each is a prolonged nightmare lifted into the realm of art. King Lear and the brothers Karamazov are also studies of evil, but if they sound no lower depths, they do climb to greater heights than Macbeth and Crime and Punishment. All four fight through again the old war between light and darkness, but in Macbeth and Crime and Punishment, we have night's predominance, as Shakespeare phrases it, and the light is that of a star or two in the blackness, while in King Lear and the Brothers Karamazov, the stars are morning stars, and there is dawn on the horizon. Page 108. Each New Day a Gash, Cycles of Violence. I think the idea that this play ultimately presents knight's predominance, despite Macbeth's defeat and Malcolm wresting the throne back from the usurper, can absolutely be found in the subtext of the play, especially in the implied violence that underlies the setting. Dartmouth professor Peter Saccio, in his teaching company lecture Macbeth, Ferris Fowle, put it this way, quote, Macbeth is a tragedy that can be readily understood as affirming an ultimately beneficent universe. Occasionally the forces of elemental strife may invade it, they may even reduce part of the world to temporary chaos, but they will withdraw. The forces of order, the forces of love will be restored. Terrible deeds do occur in the play of Macbeth, but the leading character is a bad man, or a man who turns himself bad, and he is ultimately destroyed by better men. And Malcolm regards regaining the crown as an act ordained by Providence. He closes the play by saying the proper order is put back together again. Of all Shakespeare's major tragedies, assertions about ultimate providential order are most credible with this one. But the longer I go on reading and seeing and talking about this play, the less certain I am of the total restoration. Scotland is a land in which savage butchery regularly occurs. In fact, Scotland is a land where savage butchery earns praise and admiration. There are too many repetitions, too many echoes in the final scenes of the play of the earlier ones for us to be extraordinarily optimistic. But there's another disturbing thing. Banquo's line of kings is not Malcolm's line of kings. At the end of Macbeth, at least one violent revolution is still awaiting Scotland, to get rid of the line of Malcolm and put on the line of the Stuarts. The audience knows that the full restoration that Malcolm proclaims did not in fact take place. Although a very bad man is eventually defeated by much better men, the Scotland of this play remains a destructive and terrifying world. And that's finally the reason why I have difficulty with the providential reading for the end of Macbeth. To say that Malcolm and Macduff restore or redeem Scotland is to tame or to civilize the full tragic effect. Unquote. Macbeth is soaked in an escalating violence not confined to the 5 acts we see. An invasion and a rebellion are bloodily put down before the play begins. During the play, Macbeth murders King Duncan, Duncan's grooms, Banquo, and Macduff's entire family. Lady Macbeth dies, possibly by suicide, and then the final battle kills young Seward and Macbeth himself. And as Saccio noted, there is another revolution coming after the curtain goes down. Like Macbeth says in Act 3, Scene 4, blood will have blood. Out brief candle. Nihilism. The never-ending cycle of violence hinted at in the text can be seen as a manifestation of Macbeth's exhausted bleakness. In Act 5, Scene 5, Macbeth's most famous soliloquy laments the pointlessness of it all. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty place from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the dusty way to death. Out, out brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. There's no victories, no final setting the world to right. There's just another tomorrow. People don't die for causes, they just die. And what's the point? There isn't one. Macbeth doesn't get off his murderous path because, well, what difference does it make? I'm in blood stepped in so far that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go o'er. I've always found the choice of the word tedious in that line really chilling. A decision to, stop murdering people is rejected for being tiresome and dull. Macbeth sees his kingship as a barren scepter and a fruitless crown, even before his tomorrow and tomorrow speech, as he has no children, and the witch's prophecy declares Banquo's heirs will get the throne. Seen through this lens, his fixation on murdering Banquo and Macduff's children come into focus. He has no hope for the future, and on some level he desires to inflict that hopelessness on others. His nihilistic evil is a proselytizing one. Thy gory locks, the persistence of blood. The most persistent image in the language of Macbeth is blood. People talk about it, imagine they see it, and get covered in it. It absolutely permeates the work. Deeds, business, hands, weapons, and people are all described as bloody. The first line of the play after the prologue with the witches is, "What bloody man is that?" Blood stains not only hands, but the land of Scotland itself. In Act 4, Scene 3, Macduff cries, "Bleed, bleed, poor country," and Malcolm adds, "I think our country sinks beneath the yoke. It weeps, it bleeds, and each new day a gash is added to her wounds." Even metaphorical uses of the word take on the impression of hemorrhaging wounds. When Macbeth tells Malcolm his father is dead, he says, "The spring, the head, the fountain of your blood is stopped." Act 2, Scene 3. Part 2b, Points of Interest. There's 3 more things I want to address before finally getting to the films, as they were things I was on the lookout for and they will come up in my discussion. What's done cannot be undone. Lady Macbeth. There's a joke among Shakespeare scholars that the Macbeths have the strongest marriage in Shakespeare. In their scenes together, Lady Macbeth is shown to be on at least equal footing with him, giving as good as she gets, and unusually for a female character in Shakespeare's tragedies, she both has an inner world that we are privy to and is an active agent in the plot. As Skidmore College professor Mark Connor points out in his teaching company course, How to Read and Understand Shakespeare, even her entrance, alone and reading a letter before calling on murdering ministers to take her milk for gall and fill her with direst cruelty, was potentially daring for 1606, given the time's anxiety about female education and paranoia about witches, which is often code for women who do not conform. She's immediately all in on a plan to murder Duncan as soon as she reads Macbeth's letter about the prophecy, a letter where the idea of murder is not present, and begins trying to convince or cajole or browbeat a somewhat reluctant Macbeth to go through with it as soon as he arrives. Which of those verbs is most accurate will, like so much in Shakespeare, depend on the production, and I was really curious how these films would handle her. It's supremely ironic that in her first appearance she worries that her husband is too full of the milk of human kindness, and she wants to pour her spirits into his ear to steel him for the act. By the end of the play, the monkey's paw is curled. He's descended into nihilism and cruelty, and she's broken by guilt. He's closed off from all human kindness and totally isolated from her, and humanity in general. Aught that man may question. The witches. The question as to the nature of the witches that give Macbeth the kingship prophecy is an interesting one. As University of Virginia professor Claire Kinney puts in her Shakespeare's Tragedies lectures for the teaching company, quote, "Are they instruments of a dispassionate, disinterested fate, or are they indeed the actively malicious instruments of darkness running their own interventions in human lives?" Unquote. Are they just women? Are they demonic? The witches present a philosophical question, which Professor Saccio articulates as, does Macbeth have any free will in the matter? The most terrifying possibility in this play is that he doesn't. Fairly characteristic for Shakespeare, the text leaves a good deal of ambiguity, and the play text ends without confirmation one way or the other. With this ambiguity comes a lot of possibility, depending on what the production chooses to emphasize or chooses to cut. The 4 films I looked at all handled them quite differently, which altered the implications of their existence. Side note, a 2006 Orlando Shakes production I saw cast them as beautiful young women with the aesthetic of, per the program, Japanese kabuki theater performers, i.e. all white makeup, etc. The rest of the production was a standard facsimile of medieval-looking costumes, which made the witches very otherworldly and even more explicitly supernatural. They also kept popping up throughout the play at moments of violence, especially in the end battle where they raised their arms and heads to the sky, almost ecstatically welcoming the bloodshed. It was really striking and very different than any other portrayal I'd seen or heard about. Note from future me, after watching Throne of Blood, the witches in the aforementioned production looked really reminiscent of the witch in that film, which was inspired by No and not kabuki theater tradition. There's a lot of witch stuff in the text that often gets cut, most notably their conversations with the witch goddess Hecate. Every version I've seen has cut Hecate. She seems to only make it in when a production is explicitly trying to use the unabridged text of the play. King James I, Shakespeare's patron, was obsessed with witchcraft, even writing a book on it, so it's probably not a stretch to think that Shakespeare included a bunch of stuff to scratch James's occult itch. Who did bid thee join with us? The third murderer. In Goddard's The Meaning of Shakespeare, he mentions a really interesting debate regarding the third murderer, a character only present in Act 3, Scene 3. Prior to this scene, Macbeth has recruited 2 murderers to kill Banquo and Banquo's son Fleance. As the murderers wait for their victims, an unidentified and previously unmentioned third murderer also arrives, saying Macbeth has bid him to come too. He only has about 6 lines and is never mentioned again after this scene. Some people maintain that this third murderer is actually Macbeth himself, and they marshal some interesting textual support. The third murderer seems to have some familiarity with Banquo's habits and says a line that, if played as a slip of the tongue, could indicate that he is trying to hide this familiarity. There's also an odd line in a previous scene where Macbeth makes a public declaration that he is going to sit alone for some hours, which the pro-Macbeth is the third murderer people suggest is him giving himself a public alibi for the murder he's about to help commit. Others strongly disagree with all this, and it seems to have never been the standard staging. I think it's a really interesting idea, so I decided I would pay attention to how different productions dealt with the mysterious third murderer. Part 3. On to the films. Needless to say, there's going to be spoilers. Not so much for the plot, since I've already spoiled most of that, and it's fucking Macbeth, but filmmaking spoilers. All of the films are worth watching, and I think a fixation on plot spoilers while being indifferent to craft spoilers is not good for thoughtful consumption of media. There's a great 2014 article on avclub.com by Emily St. James titled, "Why It's Time to Stop the Anti-Spoiler Paranoia," that really influenced my thoughts on this topic. Part 3A, The Lay of the Land, General Descriptions. Macbeth 1979 was directed by English theatre director Philip Casson and written by Trevor Nunn, the artistic director for the Royal Shakespeare Company. It's based on the RSC's Theatre in the Round production. There's a lot of familiar faces in addition to McKellen and Dench, including Ian McDiarmid, Star Wars' Emperor Palpatine, and Bob Peck, Jurassic Park's Muldoon. The Tragedy of Macbeth 2021 is a film by A24, the independent studio most known for its elevated horror and high-concept films like Hereditary, Midsommar, and Everything Everywhere All at Once. It was directed by Joel Cohen of the Coen brothers, who also wrote the screenplay. Macbeth 2015 was written by Todd Luiso, Jacob Kuskoff, and Michael Leslie, and directed by Justin Kurtzel. Kurtzel and Luiso went on to work on Assassin's Creed, released in 2016 and also starring both Fassbender and Cotillard, which... what? How did this group of people go on to make that movie, which from everything I've seen, is both very bad and extremely boring? Macbeth 1971 was directed by Roman Polanski and written by Polanski and Kenneth Tynan. It was produced by Playboy Studios. I don't like to inject too much retroactive psychoanalysis to a work, but it's hard not to see how this film could have been influenced by the murder of Polanski's pregnant wife Sharon Tate in their home by the Manson family in 1969. Part 3B, The Settings. Plays in Shakespeare's time were written to be performed in broad daylight on a bare stage with no sets and a few props. Any modern production, stage or film, has some decisions to make. Macbeth 79 and The Tragedy of Macbeth both have abstract settings, and Macbeth 1971 and Macbeth 2015 realistic ones. Macbeth 1971 and Macbeth 2015. Macbeth 1971 and Macbeth 2015 were both shot on location in the British Isles, with sweeping vistas and characters moving through actual landscapes and realistic sets. To put it crudely, these two look like traditional movies. Neither are sanitized visions, though Macbeth 2015 is quite a bit visually grimier. The only real divergence from realism in either film comes at the end of Macbeth 2015 during Macbeth's last stand, shot against the backdrop of a burning forest, where the whole film tints red. It's not particularly realistic looking, but it is very striking. Macbeth 1979. Macbeth 1979 is the closest to a straight-up recording of a stage play. Though it undoubtedly hews very closely to the RSC's theatre production, the cinematography and performances are distinctly calibrated to take advantage of film techniques. This is not just a camera pointed at actors giving their live theatre performance, though it aspires to have theatrical verisimilitude. There are no sets here, and the predominant aesthetic is darkness and shadow. Everything other than the actors is sunk in inky darkness, and almost all of the characters wear black, the exception being Duncan, who's in all white, and Malcolm, who wears some white. Much of the film is shot in close-up, and characters are often by themselves in the frame, even when multiple characters are on stage, an isolating effect heightened by the omnipresent pitch-black background. It feels distinctly claustrophobic, and the characters here feel far more alone than in any of the other versions. This version strikingly captures the night's predominance and Goddard's star or two in the blackness. It's a really interesting example of the cinematography reinforcing the themes. The color is also very desaturated, being almost gray or sometimes a sickly gray-green. Some early scenes of Duncan have much more color in them, though it's still fairly muted. The Tragedy of Macbeth 2021. The Tragedy of Macbeth was shot on sound stages, with Spartan modernist castle sets and dreamlike outdoor locations. None of it looks like it occurs in a real place, but it also doesn't really look like a stage. The outdoor set where Banquo is ambushed kind of looks like a set you'd see on Star Trek the original series. The severe architecture and the sharp angles in the frame, especially in the long hallways and stairs, gave me an unsettled feeling of both confinement and inevitability. It feels like your eye is being pulled inexorably down a path, and several of Macbeth's soliloquies are delivered as he's slowly drawn down the same path. This is most striking in the scene where he follows his illusory dagger down the hallway to Duncan's room while preparing himself for the fatal encounter. Just as the architecture is approaching a vanishing point, so are Macbeth's choices. It's a nice touch that Macbeth's final encounter with Macduff happens on the narrow battlements of Dunsinane, the most confined set in the film. He has no more freedom of action. The Tragedy of Macbeth was shot entirely in black and white, and the production design is kind of the opposite of Macbeth 1979. The scenes tend towards being brightly lit, and the predominant color is white. If the characters of Macbeth 1979 are lost in darkness, here they are backed by an impressive whiteness and imprisoned in light. This is a cool choice for this story, as the Macbeths literally cannot hide their crimes from themselves, and so many of the manifestations of their guilty consciences involve the act of seeing. The other persistent visual is the white mist hovering in the background of the outdoor scenes, as well as where outside would be in building sets, which both obscures that the film was shot on a soundstage and gives it a rather eerie atmosphere. Part 3C, Film versus Stage. Suit the action to the word to the action. Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 2. Close-ups in Macbeth 1979. The close-up is one of the most powerful tools in a filmmaker's arsenal. Its use in Macbeth 2015, Macbeth 1971, and the Tragedy of Macbeth isn't surprising or noteworthy, as they are ultimately fairly conventionally shot films. Tragedy, as mentioned above, has an unconventional aesthetic, but otherwise uses pretty standard, if extremely well-executed film language. The extensive use of close-ups in Macbeth 1979, however, is really interesting, given that it is far closer to a recording of a stage play than the others. It would have been really easy to just set up a few static cameras and just let the actors do their usual live theater performance, but director Phil Casson and producer Trevor Nunn opted to block and stage it in a way that feels like theater, but takes advantage of film's ability to convey subtleties that live theater can't, or at least can't to everyone in the audience, and the actors are giving film performances rather than stage performances. There's a great example of this in Macbeth's first scene after he is hailed Thane of Cawdor by Ross, confirming that the witches do indeed know the future. Macbeth, in an aside, talks about becoming king and uses the word murder, a word not used by the witches who merely hailed him as the future sovereign. Banquo says something to him which snaps him out of his musings, and Macbeth responds, "Give me your favor. My dull brain was wrought with things forgotten." He says the first two lines casually, playing a man distracted with something unimportant. But when he says things forgotten, he flicks his eyes directly to the camera. This is a signal that these words aren't for show, and this scene is not the first time he's countenanced killing Duncan. It's an incredibly small performance detail, but it's one that could not have been delivered this way on stage. Even if a glance to the entire audience could have the same sense as a glance to a singular camera, a move that subtle would have been invisible to anyone more than 5 feet away. The film is full of moments like this. It looks like theater, but is filmed and acted like a real movie. Look how our partners wrapped, asides and realism. For the 3 non-staging Macbeths, the commitment to heightened realism in the adaptation from play to film lead to some interesting changes to the text and some pitfalls. The most obvious adjustments were in how the film handled character asides. Asides in Shakespeare are speeches where the character turns to the audience to share their inner thoughts. These can have the sense of an obvious fourth wall break or can be more easily interpreted as the character just talking to themselves, depending on the staging decisions. In either case, asides are generally understood to be not heard by the other characters, even if they're standing nearby. They are marked in the playtext with the stage direction, aside. Macbeth 1971 largely did the asides in voiceover, which heightens the sense of realism, as there's no suspension of disbelief the audience has to adopt to justify why the people sitting right next to Macbeth don't react to what he is saying. John Finch's facial performance was really spectacular during these voiceovers. Despite the lines obviously being recorded at a later time, it really looked like Macbeth was thinking the words we hear in the voiceover. It seems pretty clear that Finch knew the part really well. There were also some moments where his Macbeth shifted in between voiceover and spoken lines mid-soliloquy, which gave a great sense of a man tangled up and lost in his own wandering mind. Both the Tragedy of Macbeth and Macbeth 2015 largely avoided voiceover and made the out-loud asides more natural by doing some minor textual shifts to get the speaker alone. For example, in Tragedy, when Duncan names Malcolm as his successor, Duncan's final lines in the scene are moved to before Macbeth's aside, so Macbeth can leave the room and say it aloud to himself. In general for these two films, character entrances and exits were moved around intra-scene so people didn't enter, say a line, and then stand there pretending they don't hear Macbeth talking to himself before saying another line and exiting. It isn't really noticeable unless you have the text open in front of you, or say, just watch the very unaltered Macbeth 1979 the day before. I think both films made good choices in handling the asides. A realism pitfall. Hyperrealism in Shakespeare's works can sometimes have unfortunate consequences. There are some things that work better with the Elizabethan theater of the mind. I think King Lear's famous Cliffs of Dover scene is the best example of this. In that scene, Edgar, in disguise, lies to his blind father Gloucester and says he's brought him to the Cliffs of Dover so he, Gloucester, can commit suicide. Gloucester falls forward off the cliffs, and then Edgar, pretending to be a man on the beach below, picks him up and tells him he's survived a great fall. On a bare Elizabethan stage, the audience, like Gloucester, potentially don't know they're not actually on the cliffs until Edgar immediately picks Gloucester up, so the weirdness of the scene would be hidden by the surprise of it. But after 400 years of plot spoilers and the modern era's completely different stage sensibilities, I have absolutely never seen this scene not be bizarre and immersion-breaking in an otherwise pretty grounded play. But if you're putting on King Lear, you can't really cut it because it's so crucial to Gloucester's character progression, and it's probably the most famous scene in the work. There's nothing as strange as this in Macbeth's text, but there's one moment in Macbeth 1971 where its realism works against it. And that's when Macbeth, on top of Dunsinane Castle, looks out and sees Malcolm's soldiers carrying the trees of Birnam Wood in front of them, fulfilling the witch's prophecy that Macbeth will have victory until Birnam Wood marches on Dunsinane. The problem is that in a highly realistic setting, this looks stupid. It's just this giant army weirdly carrying trees in front of them as they come over a treeless hill, so the in-text justification of them using the trees to hide their numbers really isn't a thing, especially given Macbeth's high vantage point. This is mitigated in the Tragedy of Macbeth by the weird dreamlike setting where nothing looks all that realistic. There's only a few close-in overhead shots of the army marching through the forest with the boughs up, and the branches completely obscure the soldiers, so it feels more like a metaphorical and inevitable tide of trees fulfilling the prophecy, rather than soldiers in full view awkwardly lugging them around. Like in Lear's Dover scene, part of the issue here is that Birnam Wood marching on Dunsinane is pivotal to the play and is a rather famous scene, so altering it could be fraught. Having said that, Macbeth 2015, also staged very realistically, just said fuck it and altered the plot point. In this version, Macbeth is called to Dunsinane's battlements and sees that Malcolm's forces have set the entire forest ablaze. As the ash from the burned trees wafts past him into the castle, something in him clicks and he says his line, "And now a wood comes to Dunsinane." With this, the film aesthetic shifts into the red that I mentioned earlier. For what it's worth, I really like this change. Macbeth's world is turned into a burning red hell, and the persistence of this redness even after the battle is over into the wordless epilogue of Fleance taking the sword from Macbeth's dead body and running off to vanish into the now deep crimson background really reinforces Sacchio's idea that there's at least one more violent revolution to come. Macbeth is dead, but Scotland's hell of violence will continue. To be clear, I'm not saying all productions should do this, but I think it fits this particular production really well. Part 3D, Cuts and Shuffles. All four Macbeths, to varying degrees, made cuts to the text and did some shuffling around for dramatic emphasis, in contrast to the changes I just discussed that were mostly related to the adaptation to film. I would say Macbeth 1971 is the most straight up, followed by Macbeth 1979. Neither shuffled much dialogue around. I only noticed one incredibly minor thing in Macbeth 1971. Other than cutting most of Macduff's Act 4 Scene 3 conversation with Malcolm, which Macbeth 2015 and the Tragedy of Macbeth also cut, and the witch's conversation with the goddess Hecate, which was jettisoned in all four films and in most other productions, Macbeth 1971 is really faithful to the text. Macbeth 1979 is also extremely faithful until Act 5, where it excises almost the entire final battle, cutting the fight with young Seward entirely, and leaving Macbeth isolated and alone until Macduff arrives to kill him. This fit the stripped-down setting and solipsistic mood of the film far better than a dramatic battle would have. The Big Shuffle, Macbeth 2015. Macbeth 2015 did the most shuffling, but I think pretty much all of the changes were good or at least neutral. In general, Lady Macbeth and Macduff were far more present throughout than they are in the playtext. Extra emphasis on Macbeth's ultimate antagonist more strongly centers the conflict between them, and having Lady Macbeth present for more of Macbeth's crimes reinforces her arc as a woman who becomes overwhelmed by guilt. The film, in addition to changing the Birnam Wood sequence, took another significant liberty with the play to great dramatic effect. The change, worth looking at in depth, is after Macbeth murders Duncan. He's sitting on the ground next to the body, bloody knives in his hand, and Malcolm comes into the tent and freezes. Macbeth, still sitting, says, "The spring, the head, the fountain of your blood is stopped. The very source of it is stopped. Here lies Duncan, his silver skin laced with his golden blood. There the murderers, steeped in the colors of their trade. Had I but died an hour before this chance, I had lived a blessed time. But from this instant, there's nothing serious in mortality. All is but toys. Renown and grace is dead. The wine of life is drawn, and the mere lees is left this vault to brag of." These lines are from later in the playtext after everyone has discovered the body and all the characters are standing around talking. Having the line said here to Malcolm in the room with his father's dead body changes the context of a lot of this, in both the specifics of the language and the meaning of the speech. Macbeth's line, "They're the murderers steeped in colors of their trade," in this context is referring to the bloody knives he still has in his hand, rather than being a self-serving description for why he summarily executed Duncan's passed-out servants. But on a larger scale, in the text of the play, the sincerity of all these lines is ambiguous. There may be some internal truth to what Macbeth is saying, but he is also definitely performing for other lords and courtiers to avoid suspicion. Fassbender's Macbeth is not performing. He's been caught red-handed, and there's no need to pretend. This scene is incredibly tense, and I can't say enough good things about how Fassbender and Jack Rayner as Malcolm play it. Rayner has no lines, but his performance as a man both grief-stricken and terrified he's also about to die is absolutely convincing and upsetting. It's like he's on a knife's edge. He has tears in his eyes and he doesn't seem to know what he needs to do to avoid being murdered, like he's facing down a wild animal and is afraid a wrong glance might set it off. Fassbender says his lines quietly, but his intensity and stillness is extremely unnerving, like he's a coiled spring. Macbeth rises and moves towards Malcolm as he starts the line, "Had I but died an hour before this chance," and by the time he says, "There's nothing serious in mortality," he is right in Malcolm's face, which increases the threat of the exchange, as he's both extremely close to Malcolm and is now talking like a person with absolutely nothing to lose. And then to top it off, after about 15 seconds of threatening silence, Macbeth says, "Live you, or are you aught that man may question?" This is what he said to the witches in their first encounter, but Malcolm has absolutely no idea what it means, and Rayner gives a slight whimper, seemingly sure the crazy man is about to kill him too. Then after another 15 or so seconds of silence, he slowly backs away. His eyes flick to his father's body one more time and he leaves. Macbeth makes no move to stop him. I would recommend this movie already, but I would also say that this scene alone is worth the price of admission. It's amazing that the filmmakers could make it so tense, given that metatextually, I knew Malcolm wasn't going to die here. But man, for a second I was not sure. The passage of time. All three of the more filmic Macbeths, while not altering the spoken words of Macbeth's soliloquies, spread some of them across multiple scene changes, so when Macbeth is working through his thoughts, it gives the impression that he's mulling over all of this over a long period of time. This is in contrast to the play, in Macbeth 1979, where he starts and finishes the soliloquies in the same place. This subtly reinforces the idea that in Macbeth 1979, maybe he'd already been stewing on this before he met the witches. The ground was already tilled, so he didn't need a week of contemplation to talk himself into countenancing murder. It's a small shift, but an interesting one. The tragedy of Macbeth's boss fight problem. The tragedy of Macbeth sticks out the most to me for an inclusion that I'm really ambivalent about. Tragedy includes the Act 5 fight with a sword, but the final battle as an actual battle has been tamed here, with the only people we actually see being Macbeth, Macduff, and Seward. The film made the wise choice of making the penultimate fight be with Seward rather than young Seward, as Seward actually has appeared before and has some lines. In the playtext, young Seward has been on stage in an earlier scene but doesn't say anything, so he's just kind of a random guy who shows up to get obliterated by Macbeth. In the context of a pitched and chaotic battle, this isn't all that weird, but when the fight is one of only 2 isolated duels at the climax of the film, and Seward is given the kind of dramatic entrance I'd expect for a protagonist, it makes for kind of a strange effect. Seward, while more established than young Seward, still only has about 6 lines of dialogue before this encounter. The viewer doesn't really know who this character is, probably has no opinion on him, and might not even know his name, so giving him what feels like a boss fight is unsatisfying from a dramatic structure perspective. The only other film of the 4 that stripped down and personalized the end battle so much was Macbeth 1979, and as I mentioned, it dropped this fight entirely. I suspect to avoid this issue of too much dramatic weight being put on a character that isn't established enough to support it. Having said all this, in tragedy, this scene in isolation is absolutely fantastic and compelling. Seward confronts Macbeth sitting alone in his throne room, and the filmmakers moved Macbeth's line, "Thou was born of woman," from after Seward's death to before the fight begins and changed it into a question. So after Seward blusters his lines, Macbeth, still seated, asks, "Thou was born of woman?" and then stands up without even bothering to arm himself, his arms wide open, inviting Seward to attack. It goes poorly for Seward. It's a really great scene, hence my ambivalence. Part 3E. Macbeth himself. All 4 of these Macbeths were portrayed very differently, and I think all of them were both well acted and well suited to the films they were in. Ian McKellen, Macbeth 1979. Ian McKellen is what I would call the standard Macbeth, being a thoughtful, early middle-aged man. He was about 40 at the time. His voice is assured and often commanding, and he has a certain intensity about him, amplified by how rarely he seems to blink. He sometimes made some adjustments to the rhythms of his lines during his soliloquies, putting caesuras, or very slight pauses, in unexpected places, and sometimes running over the line and sentence boundaries. I believe this was a deliberate choice, and it really gives the impression of a man navigating and sometimes getting lost in a huge mess of thoughts. McKellen is not physically imposing, which I think creates a chilling subversion. He's ostensibly a rather normal man, but by the end he absolutely will murder you. There is some hint at his penchant for violence in a small moment in the first scene with the witches, after they suddenly appear and refuse to answer Banquo's initial questioning. When Macbeth says his line, "Speak if you can, what are you?" he draws his knife and threatens them with it, brandishing it very close to their faces. In this production, the witches are dressed in ragged clothing but basically just look like regular women, and his first instinct was to threaten them with violence. Denzel Washington, The Tragedy of Macbeth. Denzel Washington's Macbeth reads as much older, both because Washington was 65 at the time of filming, and also because he plays him with a weary, almost grandfatherly gentleness, at least at the beginning. His delivery, especially at the start, is often almost under his breath, like his Macbeth isn't quite sure what he wants to say, and it adds to the gentle and weary affect. He comes across a little out of his depth in this whole murder business at first. These choices lead to some really great scenes where you see Macbeth gather his will and confidence during a speech, his voice becoming more sonorous and his words more decisive. The standouts for me are when he follows the illusory dagger to Duncan's room and when he justifies to the crowd why he killed Duncan's servants. Washington has a lot of charisma and presence. It felt like he was deliberately tamping down on both until Macbeth was crowned. Washington almost makes himself seem smaller than he is near the start, and as the play goes on, he feels like he's getting larger and more commanding. His volcanic outbursts late in the play are not over the top, but are a big contrast to his early demureness. There were a couple of moments when I think the meter got a little away from him, especially during the "if it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly" speech. There was one spot in particular where he said an entire chunk as one sentence, and it didn't quite feel right. His ability to say that much in one breath was impressive, but it was like he ran out of steam by the end. I think he was going for an effect similar to McKellen's rolling over the sentence boundaries, but I think he bit off a little too much. I don't want to overstress this point here. I only noticed a few instances of stuff like this in the film, and it was all pretty subtle. I might not have noticed at all had I not just watched McKellen and listened to Hugh Ross's Archangel Shakespeare audio version. Both McKellen and Ross are extremely experienced Shakespearean actors. Overall, I think Washington's performance was really great. Michael Fassbender, Macbeth 2015. Michael Fassbender was easily the most imposing and intimidating Macbeth, both in his physicality and his demeanor. He's a Macbeth that could easily kill you with his bare hands, and he's also the one we see do the most killing on screen. Though he's the only one who doesn't say, "My thought, whose murder yet is but fantastical, shakes so my single state of man," when he first considers the prophecy, implying the act neither immediately occurred to him nor was something he'd thought about beforehand. Macbeth 2015 opens with the battle against the rebel MacDonald, an event characters in the playtext describe but we don't see on stage. Macbeth carves his way through many people before killing the rebel, though amusingly, as Lennox describes the battle to Duncan, intercut with the fight itself, when he says Macbeth unseamed MacDonald from the nave to the chops, we very distinctly see Macbeth not do that. The line means Macbeth cut him open from his navel to his chin. In the actual battle, we see Macbeth slice him sideways across the chest. I don't know if this is a production error or a fog of war myth-making thing. Fassbender is the most active Macbeth and kills far more people with his own hands. A plot change in this version that shows a dramatic escalation in his downward spiral is that Macbeth's people do not murder Macduff's wife and children in their castle. She and her children are instead kidnapped to Dunsinane and burned at the stake, with Macbeth himself lighting the fire. The scene cuts before you see anyone actually burned to death, though you see the aftermath. This is consistent with this Macbeth being a much more hands-on agent and the most morally compromised, though in some ways perhaps the least self-deluded. He doesn't even allow himself the justification that it was not his own hands that did the deed. I realized after watching this that I'd never actually seen Michael Fassbender in, for lack of a better term, an actor's role. He was really good, and in a field of 4 excellent Macbeth leads, I think his portrayal was my favorite. John Finch, Macbeth 1971. John Finch, only in his 20s at the time, is the youngest and perhaps the most depressive Macbeth of the 4. He has a moroseness and an aura of gloom about him before he even hears the witch's prophecy. His youthful appearance contributes to a hint of naivete to him, like he's out of his depth and easier to manipulate, both by outside forces and by his own brooding. After he is crowned, he grows a beard, which instantly makes him look a lot older and could be read as a signal that any youthful innocence he had is gone from him. Finch's Macbeth earns the "this dead butcher" sobriquet most strikingly in an act of violence we don't even see occur on screen. After Lennox and Macbeth discover Duncan's body, they see the frame servants waking from their drugged stupor, and Macbeth immediately draws Lennox's sword. There's a hard cut back to the courtyard, and we only see the aftermath a few scenes later, after Macbeth is given a performative defense of noble love that drove him to execute the servants for Duncan's sake. Who can be wise, amazed, temperate and furious, loyal and neutral in a moment? No man. The expedition of my violent love outrun the pause or reason. Who could refrain that had a heart to love, and in that heart courage makes love known? When we and the other characters actually see the servants' bodies, they are completely hacked apart. A mass of blood, severed limbs, and heads. It's really gruesome and shocks the characters as much as the audience. It's an extreme escalation from what we've been shown thus far, and it's especially shocking given his characterization of it as an act of love. Part 3F, Lady Macbeth. Like with Macbeth, all 4 films handled Lady Macbeth differently, and all the performances were good to great. Marion Cotillard, Macbeth 2015. Cotillard's Lady Macbeth is perhaps the most quietly aggressive and arguably the most manipulative at the start. She's not histrionic at all and speaks softly and calmly. She always seems in control, which gave me the impression that hers had the sharpest intellect of the Lady Macbeths. She doesn't need to bluster and browbeat her husband. She can surgically sneak past his defenses with one quiet sentence. This Lady Macbeth is made more present in the narrative than the others, and, due to the scene and dialogue shuffles, we see more of her slide into guilty despair. She sees Macbeth murder the two framed servants and gets a discomfited reaction shot. The way the close-up is framed makes it a genuine reaction rather than a performative one for the benefit of the other people in the room. She was intellectually okay with murder, but she was very clearly not emotionally prepared to see it in all of its awfulness. There's a persistent thread of lost children in Macbeth 2015 that is established immediately, with the film opening on a wordless funeral for the Macbeth's young son, a scene not present in the play text or any of the other films I looked at. This opening makes these famous lines where she's putting the screws to a wavering Macbeth before the murder even more chilling. I have given suck and know how tender 'tis to love the babe that milks me. I would, while it was smiling in my face, have plucked my nipple from his boneless gums and dashed the brains out, had I so sworn as you have done to this. The speech is already terrifying, and with this version's repeated images of dead children, it hits hard. Though again, this Lady Macbeth will experience a clash between her theoretical words and the practical act, as she is present for the murder of Lady Macduff and her children, and the camera pointedly focuses on her horrified reaction. With all she's directly seen in this film, I think it's significant that for the famous out-damn spot scene, Cotillard's Lady Macbeth is not sleepwalking. She's fully awake and consciously aware of what she's saying and what led her to this moment. Cotillard delivers the monologue softly, in one long close-up shot while looking just off camera center. There's no motion here from either her or the camera, but it's compelling and moving in its quiet, understated stillness. I particularly liked her emotional inflection point when she says, "The Thane of Fife had a wife. Where is she now?" And her lip trembles slightly and her eyes brim with tears. The last lines of the soliloquy are, "Come, come, come, come. Give me your hand. What's done cannot be undone. To bed, to bed, to bed." This takes on a subtly different character when there's a cut that reveals her dead son sitting in front of her. This, along with the fact that the film cuts her line about Banquo here, ties the speech tightly into the lost children theme, and reveals why the reference to Lady Macduff was the moment when her emotions started to spill over. Cotillard's performance here was probably my favorite take on the material. Two other things in Macbeth 2015 characterize Lady Macbeth differently than the other films. The first is a small adjustment made to the Act 3 Scene 2 conversation between Lady Macbeth and her husband when he's starting to talk a little crazy. In the playtext, she tries to soothe him with, "You must leave this." Then he describes his mind as being full of scorpions and ominously brings up Banquo and his son Fleance. When she asks him what he's going to do, he says, "Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck." She doesn't know it, but Macbeth had already sent two murderers to kill Banquo and Fleance in a previous scene. A scene where he also lamented to himself that he murdered a man to put Banquo's line on the throne. In this version, the line, "You must leave this," is shifted to after he drops the ominous line about Banquo and Fleance. She doesn't say it as an abstract, "It's better to stop thinking about what's already done," and says it as, "Don't do what I think you're about to do." Another adjustment is after Macbeth learns that Macduff has fled to England. On hearing the news, Macbeth says, "From this moment the very firstlings of my heart shall be the firstlings of my hand, and even now, to crown my thoughts with acts, be it thought and done." Unlike the playtext, where this is an aside, here he says it out loud in front of Lady Macbeth, and she answers with lines taken from her Act 5 out-damn spot speech. "Hell is murky. What's done cannot be undone." More than any other Lady Macbeth, she's trying to stop him. Francesca Annis, Macbeth 1971. Francesca Annis, like John Finch, was in her 20s at the time, and Lady Macbeth being so young makes her read differently than the others. To me, she came across as more impulsive and less Machiavellian, though no less ambitious. The tears in her eyes after he tells her, "We will proceed no further in this business," seemed to come from genuine shock at his reneging of the promise to her, especially given that they happened during a sotto voce conversation in public where they're not even looking at each other. Who would performative tears even be for in this setting? It feels less manipulative and more of a genuine surge in emotion for this Lady Macbeth. This production also cuts her lines about knowing what it's like to nurse an infant and being willing to kill it if she had made a promise to. This softens her quite a bit compared to the others, and I can't help but wonder if this line was a bridge too far for a director whose pregnant wife was recently murdered. Like Cotillard's Lady Macbeth, Annis also finds out very quickly that she is not prepared for the fallout, and this is revealed through some really great and subtle acting. She is genuinely concerned and upset on Macbeth's behalf when he returns from the murder distraught and saying, Methought I heard a voice cry, "Sleep no more. Macbeth has murdered sleep." And when she sees he still has the bloody daggers with him, her line read of, "Why did you bring these daggers from the place?" comes across more as horror at seeing the bloody instruments rather than shock at his foolishness for keeping them on him. She also seems genuinely affected by the blood on her hands after she returns after planting the daggers on the servants. To me, Annis's performance during her line, "A little water clears us of this deed," came across as unsteady hope rather than callousness. We see a lot less of this Lady Macbeth than we did of Cotillard's, though she does get an added moment, not in the playtext, where she sees blood on her hands long before her sleepwalking scene. In said sleepwalking scene, Lady Macbeth is definitely asleep and is more insensate throughout. Her doctor stands right next to her and waves his hand in front of her eyes, which she does not react to. This scene apparently caused some hue and cry at the time because Annis is naked throughout it. Neither the camera nor the doctor leer at her, and she just walks into the room and sits down while she's talking. To be honest, if I didn't know this was a thing people had an issue with, I probably wouldn't have even noticed. Judi Dench, Macbeth 1979. I feel kind of bad that I don't have more to say about Dench's performance, but that may be an expectations thing. I had heard about her performance and was expecting her to be excellent, and, well, she was. It was a very layered and powerful performance that took advantage of the tight close-ups this film favored. I'd say her scenes where she argued with McKellen were standouts, but basically every scene she was in was a standout. She wasn't big or bombastic, and her pinched anger felt very natural and realistic. Dench definitely portrayed Lady Macbeth as an equal to her husband, and in their interactions they came across as a loving couple who knew how to work through conflict and with each other. To me, she seemed more like she was trying to persuade him rather than manipulate him. Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are the most intimate in this version. In the first half, they are usually touching, with their heads very close together when they talk, and the close-in framing amplifies this intimacy. It also presents a stark contrast later when, after Macbeth is hardened towards the world, they are far apart in the blocking and isolated in the frames. Dench's sleepwalking scene was a really powerful expression of broken grief and guilty conscience. Her eyes are frantic, brimming with tears. She can barely even say the word blood, and her almost panicked sucking of her fingers to try to get the imaginary blood off was profoundly sad. Frances McDormand, The Tragedy of Macbeth. Lady Macbeth's dynamic with her husband is the most different in tragedy. They are both the oldest by quite a bit, and between that and how their interactions are played, they come across as a more companionate couple, out of the young love phase and into affectionate, if no longer passionate partners. I'd say McDormand's Lady Macbeth is the most forceful of the four I watch, and she's a great contrast to her soft-spoken Macbeth. She's also the least affected by the pangs of conscience in the first half. A comparison to McDormand's performance to Dench's in the small moment where Duncan asks her to take his hand neatly encapsulates this. Dench greets Duncan with big smiles, but when he asks her to take his hand, she's caught off guard. She stares at him for a moment and then slowly looks at his hand in hesitation before snapping her gaze back to his and taking it. For all her talk of wanting to be filled with the direst cruelty, this small physical intimacy with Duncan twinges her conscience. Dench doesn't overplay the moment, but it's definitely there. McDormand plays the hand scene differently, with a hint of smug superiority, as if she's thinking, "He's just handing himself over into my power. He's mine now. This couldn't have gone better." Another moment I really liked was in the scene where Macbeth tries to justify to the stunned lords why he summarily executed the framed servants. He begins his speech at the top of a staircase, a touch unconvincingly, and Lady Macbeth looks concerned, as if she's worried he won't be up to the first test and will give the game away. Macbeth gains his bearings and he becomes more confident as he descends. He addresses the speech directly to her, and she gets 3 close-up reaction shots. Indeed, she's the only character other than Macbeth to get a close-up, and even in the one shot of all the listeners, she's in the dead center of the frame, with everyone else set apart in a semicircle behind her. Visually, the film conveys that he's primarily proving to her that he's up to it, and only secondarily performing for the others. And though there's ambiguity, to me the expression on her face just before she faints made it look like she was proud of him. And maybe I shouldn't have said faints. Unlike in Macbeth 1971, I wasn't convinced her swoon wasn't performative. McDormand's sleepwalking scene was also rather different than the others. She's the least dazed and the most manic. Her line, "Yet who'd have thought the old man to have so much blood in him," has a distinct irritation to it as she scrubs her hands, like she's sublimating a guilty conscience with performative and dismissive anger. It seems like she's hanging on by a very thin thread. There's also a nice touch of ambiguity at the end as she says, "To bed, to bed, to bed," when on the 3rd repetition, she looks directly at the watching doctor and nurse and practically barks it at them. Maybe she wasn't asleep after all. There's one odd line cut in this scene where Lady Macbeth says, "What, will these hands ne'er be clean?" I thought it was a little strange to cut that line as the underlying motif of the scene, and maybe the play in general, is seeing blood on hands. It's hardly a big thing, but I wonder why it was cut, especially considering it is present in the script I found online. What's in a question mark? This is more of a general Shakespeare thing, but it's neat, and it's Lady Macbeth's line, so here we are. When Macbeth expresses concern about the plan, the play text goes like this. Macbeth, if we should fail, Lady Macbeth, we fail, but screw your courage to the sticking place and we'll not fail. Judi Dench and Marion Cotillard read the line as written, which has a sense of a scoff of disbelief at his reticence followed by an exhortation. Something like, how could we possibly fail? Just be a man and we won't. Frances McDermott and Francesca Annis, though, read it subtly differently, without the question mark. So, if we should fail, we fail. But screw your courage to the sticking place and we'll not fail. This is a very different sense for such a subtle change, reading as solidarity and a gentle suggestion. More, if we fail, we fail. But if you have courage, we won't. It's more supportive. Whatever happens, they'll work through it together. I just think it's really cool how small decisions like this can change the sense of a line. Part 3G, The Witches. Macbeth 1979. The witches in Macbeth 79 are rather normal-looking women, if shabbily dressed, with two being older and one younger. What is interesting is how the production handled the younger witch, played by Susan Dury. She seems touched, usually staring off into the distance, barely able to function by herself, and she is the one who can see the future. The witch's dialogue has been shuffled around a little bit, with Dury's wit stripped of the conversational banter with her sisters and only acting as an oracle to answer their direct questions about what's to come, or bolting upright and shouting short prophetic statements. Her gifts have apparently come at great costs. She seems to be terrified and in pain when she sees the future. In Act 4, Scene 1, she interrupts the witch's double, double, toil and trouble chant with a choked sob of, by the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes, just before Macbeth arrives. There's no satisfaction or glee at Macbeth's descent, just anguish, and all the seeing appears to have broken her completely. During the film's prologue, the first sound the young witch makes is a long, pained howl as her unfocused eyes gaze into the distance. In Lady Macbeth's sleepwalking scene, the playtext has a line that just reads, oh, 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 and in this production, Dench let out an agonizing cry that lasted like 25 seconds. It very much harkened back to the witch's howl that started the film. Too much seeing has broken her as much as it broke the young witch. This all puts the witches on the passive witness end of the spectrum. They feel less like they're causing any of this action. The Tragedy of Macbeth. On the opposite end of the spectrum are the witches in the Tragedy of Macbeth, easily the creepiest portrayal of the four films. In the Witches Act 1, Scene 1 prologue, we hear their three distinctive voices, but we do not see them. When they finally appear on screen just before meeting Macbeth and Banquo, we see that there is only one woman, switching between the three voices in conversation with herself. It's rather unsettling, especially considering the actress Catherine Hunter is also doing some contortionist-type stuff, with her arms and legs doing unnatural things. It's very modern horror movie. When Macbeth and Banquo meet her, she is standing in front of a pond, but there are two offset reflections in the water. After the prophetic conversation, they vanish in the mist, and then three squawking birds fly out past the two men. Macbeth's Act 4 appeal to them happens in his castle, where three Catherine Hunters perch above him on rafters and drop the potion ingredients into a puddle to show him the apparitions. They're very reminiscent of vultures. Also, the witches surprising him in his castle makes the line, by the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes, almost feel like it heralds their arrival rather than his, the way it does in the text. These witches feel the most like they are actively driving the tragedy, and a shift in the order of their dialogue just before their first encounter with Macbeth gives the impression that they are intentionally targeting him in specific. In the playtext, the witches arrive and have a conversation among themselves where the first witch talks about a woman who was rude to her, and her intent to take revenge by tormenting the woman's sailor husband. She says, I'll drain him dry as hay. Sleep shall neither night nor day hang upon his penthouse lid. He shall live a man forbid. Weary 7 nights 9 times 9 shall he dwindle peak and pine. And shortly after, the second witch says, a drum, Macbeth doth come. In tragedy, the line signaling Macbeth's arrival is moved just before this, and the mention of the rude woman and her husband has been excised, so the I'll drain him dry speech refers to Macbeth in this context. This also makes Macbeth's later line after Duncan's murder that, methought I heard a voice cry sleep no more, feel like a callback to the witch's threat. It's another example of small shifts in the line order having reverberations in the sense and context of the story. Macbeth 2015. The witches in this version are just regular-looking women, and they are definitely the least sinister witches of the four productions. This film also cuts their line about summoning their dark masters to answer Macbeth's questions on his second visit, which disassociates them from the overtly demonic. They first appear after the funeral for the Macbeth's child and give their opening lines as they watch from a distance. They seem sad. The timeline is fuzzier here, as after the second witch says, "When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won," no one replies with, "That will be before the set of sun." It's an interesting change, as it implies that they've been watching Macbeth for some time before their first meeting on the heath. Showing the witches at the funeral right at the beginning strongly ties the prophetic elements of the story to the loss of children, and makes this loss a main driver of the action, if a mostly subtextual one. The three witches, after their first appearance, are always shown to have children with them, and the young boy soldier whose death looms large in Macbeth's mind appears to see them before he is killed. It's almost like they are the guardians of the dead children in a brutal Scotland. They are a little more present too, as Macbeth sees them silently watching both the opening and closing battles of the film. Lady Macbeth also sees them in the hills around Dunsinane right after her out-damn spot scene, which, recall, ended with her addressing her dead son. She repeats to bed and walks towards them. They are holding a baby and standing with another small child. Macbeth 1971. The three witches in this film, at least at the beginning, just seem to be regular, if creepy women. One is blind, as in has skin covering where her eyes should be, and the youngest, who seems perhaps a bit insane, does not speak at all. All of her lines are shifted to the other two. What's really unusual is their second appearance, where Macbeth goes down into the stone structure they live and finds a huge gathering of naked old women. He stumbled into their entire coven. It's hard not to wonder if this inspiration to portray the witches as part of an organized and ritualistic cult came from the Manson family. Part 3H. The Third Murderer. As I mentioned earlier, after reading Goddard's essay, I decided to pay attention to the identity of the third murderer. I was a little surprised to get 3 different answers across the 4 films. In Macbeth 1979, the third murderer is Macbeth's attendant Satan, a minor character who only has about 5 lines. He's just one notch above some random guy, but it does make sense to have the third murderer be one of Macbeth's trusted servants, even if we don't see all that much of him. In Macbeth 2015, Macbeth has his ostensibly friendly conversation with Banquo about what Banquo's travel plans are while flanked by 2 men we have not seen before. Macbeth and the men are mounted, while Banquo and Fleance are on foot, so there's an ominous power dynamic in the blocking. After Banquo and Fleance leave, Macbeth turns to the 2 men and reveals that they are the 2 murderers. In the actual murder scene, no third murderer appears. With this setup, and given the way Macbeth was framed visually with the 2 murderers, the film is letting us know that Macbeth himself is the third murderer in a metaphorical sense, even though he is not physically present at the killing. I think this is really cool, and I suppose it's kind of an Easter egg for people who know the play decently well. The conversation between Macbeth and Banquo is really tense too. Banquo clearly is suspicious of Macbeth and has no idea who these 2 men are. You can see him debating with himself about whether he's already in his former friend's crosshairs, or whether being evasive might be the thing that puts him there. Also, having the murderers present makes practical sense in universe, as that way they will know what their targets look like. But it is also really chilling, in that the killers have no qualms about murdering a man and a young boy, even after humanizing them with an in-person meeting. Both Macbeth 1971 and the Tragedy of Macbeth make Ross, Macduff's cousin and one of the Scottish nobles, the third murderer. And on that note, a look at Ross. Part 3I. Ross. Ross is a good case study in how productions can create different emphasis or implications by shifting and shuffling material, even for minor characters. In the playtext, Ross is mostly there for exposition and message delivery. He tells Duncan about Macbeth's victory over the invading Norwegians, tells Macbeth that Duncan has made him Thane of Cawdor, tells Lady Macduff her husband went to England, and then tells Macduff that his family has been murdered. He is also shown at Macbeth's court when Macbeth sees Banquo's ghost, but he's kind of just another guy who's there. Macbeth 2015 de-emphasizes Ross, with his pivotal interaction with Macduff, i.e. telling him his family has been murdered, being shifted to Malcolm. This makes dramatic sense, as in this version Malcolm is far better established, with Ross's other notable scene in the text, the earlier one where he talks to Lady Macduff, having been cut entirely. He's a non-entity to the point that I wasn't even sure which actor was him. In Macbeth 1971, he's expanded from guy who sometimes stands in Macbeth's court to enthusiastic backer of Macbeth as king, to the point where he is willing to be the third murderer and then oversee the murder of the 2 killers to get rid of any witnesses. Here he's not only aware, but complicit in Macbeth's deeds. All of this gives a sinister cast to the otherwise textually accurate scene where he's talking to Lady Macduff about her husband leaving Scotland. Shortly after he exits, Macbeth's men attack and the slaughter ensues. We've seen him do heinous things in service of Macbeth before, so it really implies he coordinated the attack and maybe even left the gate open. This is his cousin's family he helps execute. At the end, when he goes to Malcolm's camp to give Macduff the news, there's a pointed shot of him looking at the siege engines and troops Malcolm has raised. The next time we see him, he is fighting with Malcolm. It seems he saw which way the wind was blowing, and there's no comeuppance for him. The Tragedy of Macbeth expands him even more to mixed results. He's an inveterate schemer in this, playing all sides against each other, being the third murderer, but then helping Fleance escape. He talks to Lady Macduff about her husband and does not warn her, despite clearly knowing Macbeth's men are coming to kill her. He sees them coming over the hill and just slips away. He is very pointedly shown approaching Lady Macbeth on the stairs right before her body is found, implying he killed her. After Malcolm is crowned, the movie adds an epilogue of him taking Fleance from his hiding spot and riding off with him somewhere. Ross does all this plot twisting and untwisting, but it's really unclear what his game actually was. I have no idea what his goals were. It's an interesting idea for the character, but with the constraint when doing Shakespeare that you can't really invent entire scenes of backstory for side characters, this is a tough sell, and it felt like scheming for scheming's sake. Shades of late-season Littlefinger from Game of Thrones. Ross was one of the characters that I felt slipped his meter the most, and occasionally nearly stumbled on his lines. But after seeing how his character was handled, I think maybe this was a conscious choice, as the stumbles I noticed were in scenes where he was potentially being duplicitous. So maybe it was an acting choice to show that he was struggling to come up with convincing lies? Ross's actor, Alex Hassel, does seem to be an experienced Shakespearean actor, with some leading roles in Royal Shakespeare Company stage productions, so I wouldn't expect him to have trouble with the cadence or flow of the dialogue. But I don't know. Also, I made this note after Ross's first scene. Man, this Ross is a fucking weirdo. Part 3I. Duncan and Motive. Another interesting thing is the different way the four films characterize King Duncan, even with his very limited screen time, and how this, particularly in Macbeth 1979 and Macbeth 2015, potentially reveals some subtextual motive for his murder aside from just ambition. Macbeth 1979. This Duncan is visually set apart from the rest of the cast, dressed all in white in vestments reminiscent of a clergyman. He's the oldest Duncan of the four, and Griffith Jones plays him as a Henry VI type, a good man, naive and ineffectual, who is more suited towards devout contemplation than leading his people in a violent time. He's introduced praying, even as his generals die fighting his war. The witch's primal howl is intercut with his praying, and he struggles to maintain his concentration. It signals him as beleaguered and not up to facing the forces entangling Scotland. It's not a stretch to see that maybe Macbeth has considered murder before the witch's prophecy, because he sees Scotland as needing a strong hand against the endemic violence, a strength that Duncan did not possess. Macbeth 2015. Duncan himself doesn't make much of an impression here, though he looks like way less of a naive idiot than he often does, because the film took out his line, "Re the traitorous Thane of Cawdor." There's no art to find the man's construction in the face. He was a gentleman on which I built an absolute trust. In the playtext right after he says this, i.e., what a terrible judge of character he is, Macbeth enters, and Duncan immediately gives him effusive praise about how wonderful and trustworthy this new Thane of Cawdor is. This can actually read as kind of funny depending on the production. Removing this makes him look less hapless and out of his depth. This film very pointedly shows before the opening battle that the reserves that Duncan sent to reinforce Macbeth are barely more than children. When Macbeth and Banquo first see them, they are dismayed, and there's a mournful scene of Macbeth tying a sword to the young boy soldier's hand. The boy soldier's death is given a lot of emphasis, both in the actual death and the aftermath, with Macbeth's, "If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly," over him laying the coins over the dead boy's eyes, the same way he laid coins over his dead son's eyes in the beginning. In the scene where Macbeth sees the imaginary dagger leading him to Duncan, he sees that dagger being wordlessly held by the dead boy soldier, and Macbeth addresses his speech to him. So Duncan's murder is directly and visually tied to the dead children of Scotland, who died to keep the king on the throne. This is all fitting with this film's pervasive theme of lost children, and is perhaps part of the reason Macbeth is okay with murdering Duncan. Macbeth 1971. King Duncan is the strongest here. In the opening of the film, Duncan, in full armor, is usually shot from below, and he's in the right side of the frame, which is filmic shorthand for power. He seems forceful and engaged, with his opening scene being on a beach that's littered with the corpses from the Battle of Macdonald. Duncan is shown the most in this version, especially at the celebration at Macbeth's castle, where he is taking every opportunity to hang on Lady Macbeth's every word and dance with her. So the murder is less theoretical here. Macbeth's musings on murder occur over images of Duncan having fun at a party. In keeping with the unsanitized and morally grimy Scotland of the film, The court around Duncan, and later Macbeth, are pretty awful. The line about Macbeth cutting a man open from the nave to the chops got a laugh from the surrounding attendants. And that no one, not even Duncan, has any qualms about having a triumphant conversation amidst a bunch of corpses reinforces the callousness of the setting. The Tragedy of Macbeth. We don't see much of Duncan here, but like most of the people in Tragedy, he seems tired and weary. He is in full armor when we see him the first time. He's just kind of a guy. Part 3K. A couple of random things about Macduff. Macbeth 2015. Sean Harris as Macduff is an interesting casting choice to me. I feel a little mean saying this, but he just kind of has a sinister face, which I guess isn't surprising as he seems to often play villains or unstable people. He's quite good as Macduff, and he has an unnerving intensity to him, which is kind of cool for a heroic antagonist to the villainous protagonist. It's like he and Fassbender are cast in the opposite roles you'd expect for the relative virtues of their characters. Also, and this isn't really about Macduff, but I really like how Jack Reynor played the response to Macduff's grief. Dispute it like a man? As almost a question, rather than the fiery, dispute it like a man, of Stephen Chase in Macbeth 1971. What do you tell someone who has just lost what Macduff has? Raynor's Malcolm has no idea, and it's keeping with his portrayal as a determined but sensitive and a little overwhelmed Malcolm. Chase's delivery is extremely appropriate for the film he's in, with the repeated shots of people laughing at brutality and shrugging off any violence. Macbeth 1979. I thought it was interesting that this film doesn't show Macbeth being killed on screen, and Macduff enters, not with Macbeth's head as the stage directions indicate, but with two bloody knives, held in the same way and given the same weighty emphasis as when Macbeth entered with two bloody knives after murdering Duncan. This moment is not triumphant. Macduff and everyone else just seem dazed at the horror they just experienced. It has an extremely downbeat atmosphere. Macbeth 1971. In keeping with the aromantic tone of this film, Macbeth's fight with Macduff is really ugly and uncoordinated, almost feeling more like a drunken bar brawl compared to Macbeth's skillful fight with young Seward and his accompanying soldiers. It's an interesting devolution, and there's nothing pretty about it, just two men wailing on each other at the climax of this whole ugly drama. Part 4. Gallimaufry. I have a lot more to say, but wow, this has gotten long, so here's just some quick hit observations about the films, in no particular order. Part 4A, Macbeth 1979. Hey look, Lord John Marbury is Malcolm. I mentioned the predominance of shadows in this film, and there's a very striking shot of Macbeth commissioning the two murderers where the lighting really reminds me of how Bela Lugosi was lit during his hypnosis scenes in Dracula 1931. I don't know if it was a DVD transfer thing, but there was a very low hum buried beneath the film's sound. I didn't notice it until the murder scene, but it was kind of unnerving. It's kind of cool that no apparitions are shown in this film. Macbeth sees Banquo's ghost, but we don't, nor do we see the visions the witches give him. It increases the feeling that he's cracking up. Instead of the apparitions talking to him in the second witch scene, they are dramatis personae in the playtext, the witches have these creepy totem heads on sticks, which they hold up while they say the lines the apparitions usually deliver. It's a nice ambiguity, like maybe the dark powers are speaking through them. Also, Macbeth keeps one of the totems for the rest of the play and often talks to it, which is also creepy. Part 4B, The Tragedy of Macbeth. Hey, it's my man Corey Hawkins as Macduff, and I absolutely did not know he was American until like 2 hours ago. I need to watch something of his where he's not being terrorized by a vampire or a tyrant. There's a lot of birds in this, mostly reminiscent of carrion birds and vultures. I really like the scene where Macbeth follows the dagger to Duncan, in the blocking, the shot selection, and Washington's performance. When Macbeth is standing over Duncan prior to the murder, Duncan wakes up and Macbeth puts a finger to his lips. Part of me wants to believe that that was Washington reminding Gleeson not to say anything, because Shakespeare didn't write any lines here. There's some nice subtle touches in the scene where Duncan's body is discovered. When Macduff cries out from off stage, Macbeth, talking to Lennox, turns his head towards the sound, just a hair too slowly for someone who should have been more surprised. Also, Macbeth gets a quick reaction shot after Macduff comes back on screen, and Washington seemed to steel himself, like, here we go. It was a really great scene. Just before Duncan's body is found, Washington's delivery of the line, "'Twas a rough night," in response to Lennox describing the storm that occurred the night before, was probably my favorite of any of the films. I don't super like the use of Banquo's ghost here. I guess it's more exciting to have him stalk the castle and attack Macbeth, but I think Macbeth 2015's usage was more powerful, where he just stares at Macbeth. More guilty conscience-ish. Part 4C, Macbeth 2015. This film had a few moments of stylized and disorienting editing, most notably in the opening battle and during Macbeth's soliloquy just before he goes to kill Duncan. It's like they weave footage from completely different takes together. It was cool in the opening battle, but it primed me to expect more experimental or surreal editing throughout, which really didn't happen. I really liked the effect of it during Macbeth's soliloquy. Most of this film is shot handheld and is a little wobbly, even in dialogue scenes. I didn't really register it until one of the interior candlelit scenes where the slight motions of the camera combined with the flickering of the candles made it pretty noticeable. It never quite got distracting for me, but your mileage may vary. The scenes in Dunsinane after Macbeth is crowned, though, all seemed locked off and steady. There were a couple of odd edits in this where it almost felt like it got caught in a no man's land, where it should have either cut away more quickly or showed the end of the action. It wasn't pervasive, but there was one early on with the execution of Cawdor, which primed me to look for it. I really liked the shuffle of having Lady Macduff be brought to Macbeth and he burns her alive, but there was a weird line in it where she says, "This tyrant whose sole name blisters our tongues was once thought honest," and then the scene cuts before he lights the stake. That line is originally Malcolm's, and while it makes sense that she might say it, it's snipped out of a different context, so it feels kind of weird as a standalone, like it's an incomplete thought. Kind of a weird moment in an added scene that I thought overall was a really good adjustment. The whole red ending was really striking and memorable. Part 4D, Macbeth 1971. Lindisfarne Castle is a really cool and severe stand-in for Dunsinane. I like how in the conversation between Banquo and Ross after Macbeth is crowned, it just looms in the background. One of the first things we see in the film, on the beach in the aftermath of the battle against MacDonald, is a wounded man crawling on the ground before another man walks up and gruesomely beats him to death with a flail. It's a good introduction to the grim setting. The film adds a wordless scene just before the end credits roll, where Duncan's younger son Donalbain, in a driving rainstorm, goes to the witch's dwelling. This directly parallels Macbeth's scene at the beginning of the film and points to a continuation of the cycle of violence. It's pretty bleak. Part 5. Conclusion and recommendations. So what's the take-home message here, other than I have too much time on my hands? This journey has reiterated to me why Macbeth is one of the great tragedies in the English language, and watching these 4 very different films gives a good feel for the flexibility the Bard's work has, even after 400 years and countless productions. All of these films were good and worth watching. Macbeth 2015 was the standout surprise here, as it came and went kind of under the radar in 2015. I only saw one review of it, and a rather negative one at that. Revisiting the review after having seen the film, I heartily disagree with basically all of it. So if you're looking for the most movie version of Macbeth, I'd start with Macbeth 2015, with the caveat that it took the most liberties with the source material. That is not intended to be a criticism, by the way. Macbeth 1971 also functions the most like a normal movie, but is more straight up to the source material. You can find places to watch it for free if you have reservations about enriching the director. The Tragedy of Macbeth is the most experimental and weird version, and Macbeth 1979 is the most like a stage production. You really can't go wrong with any of them, so pick your poison. I'd say I'm going to take a rest from thinking about Macbeth for a while, but you know I'm absolutely not going to. I just watched Throne of Blood and have a lot of thoughts. Opera Orlando's production of Verdi's Macbeth is coming up, and I just found out that Orlando Shakes is doing a production this fall. There's no turning back now. To quote the man himself, "I am in blood stepped in so far. Should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go o'er." Originally published September 23rd, 2024. This has been the Have Mandolin Will Travel podcast. I'm Matt Giuliano, and I hope you've enjoyed this piece. Check out havemandolinwilltravel.com for a closer look at some of my other projects and to hear my music. Cheers and happy listening.